Climate change is frequently referred to as the greatest moral and policy challenge of our time. And last week, the Tasmanian government released its action plan to reduce emissions. With a Green climate change minister, it was hoped there'd be far-reaching action. But the plan's being described as a disgrace and a recipe for inaction. The chair of the government's Climate Action Council and a leading analyst on climate change says it won't lead to significant short-term emission reductions. Reducing carbon emissions has long been an issue the Greens have lobbied for. Last week, a Greens minister in Tasmania's minority government launched the state's action plan.
This is a really significant day for Tasmania. We're launching the government's action plan to reduce emissions.
Look, you've got about half of all the impact out of the carbon pricing package.
Not everyone's convinced the plan is significant or about action.
And quite frankly, we were just disgusted with this plan. It's manifestly inadequate for the task.
I think you would expect probably much more from a Green minister. I mean, obviously you would expect more from a Green minister than you would from any other sort of minister.
Head of the School of Government at the University of Tasmania, Associate Professor Kate Crowley, also chairs Tasmania's Climate Action Council. The council was established in 2008 after the state legislated to reduce emissions by 60% of 1990 levels by 2050. While the council is yet to discuss the plan, Professor Crowley is disappointed with it.
Titled Action Plan, but I wouldn't say it's got the status or the credibility of a full policy statement, and it's difficult to see how it will lead to significant emission reductions in the short term, which is what we need to be looking for.
The Climate Action Council, made up of experts across science, business, government and the community, was set up to provide advice to the government on how best to achieve its emissions reduction target. Its first key report was hailed by then Climate Change Minister, Greens leader Nick McKim, as a crucial step in one of the most important policy development processes in Tasmania's history.
I'll be taking a plan to deliver strong action on climate change to Cabinet, and I believe that I will be able to get the support of my Cabinet colleagues.
The Council's provided 2 key reports to government over the past 12 months, but says it's yet to get a formal response to either of them.
This is really quite urgent that we get a good interim target, and it should be that interim target that is driving a climate action plan. I don't think it's logical to have an action plan without the interim target.
In the second report made public earlier this year, the Council urged the government to set an interim target of a 25% cut in emissions by 2020. But that has not been followed through?
No, and I was working it out on the back of an envelope the other day. It's not very long till 2020. We're in 2011 now. We made a recommendation at the end of 2010 for an interim target.
I acknowledge that, but ultimately an interim target is a matter for Cabinet. Now, I've made it very clear that I plan to take a proposal for an interim target to Cabinet by the end of this year.
The wholesale price goes up for everyone, and that then flows through to Tasmania across Basslink in effect.
Phil Harrington's held numerous national and international positions advising on energy and climate change, including the International Energy Agency in Paris. He currently provides analysis for the Federal Department of Climate Change. As a member of Climate Action Hobart, he says the state plan suggests the government is not taking the issue seriously.
There's no new policy initiatives, there's no new targets, there's no new spending. The funding that's provided has all been announced in the past, and it amounts to less than 0.1 of 1% of the Tasmanian government's budget.
He's compared it with the ACT's legislated commitment to more than halve their current levels by 2020.
Yes, interestingly, Ellie, there's a very similar government structure there. We have a Labor-Green alliance government in the ACT, and they've delivered a very powerful greenhouse policy in that territory. And yet in Tasmania, unfortunately, this document we don't believe is credible.
Sometimes it is frustrating being a minister for climate change and not being able to fix it all overnight.
While acknowledging there are some positives in the government's plan, such as assistance for energy efficiency in public housing, Mr Harrington says they'll reduce emissions by only a fraction.
Tasmania was the last state in Australia to move to 5-star housing. It's not yet adopted a COAG-wide agreement to move to 6-star that was first agreed some 2 years ago, and where a deadline of 1 May has come and gone, and Tasmania has not taken up that suggestion. We are the only state that is failing to implement a nationwide agreement to phase out these electric storage hot water systems that are very inefficient. And so it's not just that we're not leading, we're actually well behind every other state and territory.
My word, definitely. We need to be doing those things, and I'll be advocating for them with my Cabinet colleagues.
Mr Harrington says given Tasmanian households use twice as much electricity as other Australian households, the state has more to gain by improving energy efficiency. He also says there's not enough in the plan to assist the state's big emitters, which face significant challenges with the introduction of a carbon price next year.
If we look at the actions proposed for the biggest emitters in the state, they are to set up a round table and to hold discussions. One would have thought that could have been done many, many years ago.
Tasmania emits about 1% of Australia's emissions, and Australia is responsible for about 1% of global emissions. So is there an urgency for Tasmania to reduce its carbon footprint?
We've got one of the largest per capita footprints. That is, we're more wasteful and more emitting of pollution, carbon pollution, than any other nation virtually in the world. We are right up at the very top of the list.
Even Tasmania on its own, if it were a country, would be amongst the top 20 per capita emitters in the world. Now that's not something that a lot of people are aware of. Australia is right up there amongst the very highest, but even Tasmania, at about 17 tonnes of emissions per person per year, is one of the highest in the world. So we have a responsibility to do our part.
Imported emissions from brown coal generated power across Basslink are not included in the statistics.
The Council has advised Government to include those emissions so that we get the clear and true and honest picture, and so that we don't shirk the challenge.
If we do nothing, our emissions will clearly continue to rise. This document that the government has put out shows that emissions have been rising in this state since 2007. That doesn't take into account the imports of coal-fired electricity across Basslink, so if you took that into account, they'd be rising even further. One of the consequences of that for all Tasmanians is that we will pay more for our power. We will pay more under carbon pricing in future if we fail to reduce our carbon emissions and our energy consumption.